It's a sound that cuts through the stillness of the mountains, a rhythmic metallic roar that echoes through the canyons and escapes into the valleys. To many, it's just the noise of a heavy truck descending. But to those behind the wheel and to those who know the truth behind it, that sound is not noise. It's a sigh of relief. It is the sound of physics being tamed. It is the beating of a mechanical heart that instead of pumping power, pumps safety. Because that characteristic roar is the last line of defense before the heat turns the brakes to ash, before a 20-kilometer descent becomes an uncontrollable countdown. Today, we are not only going to explain what a Jake brake is. Today, we are going to delve into the belly of a diesel engine to witness a radical transformation where the machine that gives life to the truck becomes, through the will of its engineers and the skill of its driver, the most powerful anchor that exists. A story of how an engine's greatest enemy can be, paradoxically, the engine itself. The weight of gravity. Imagine for a moment that your responsibility is not to carry a bag from the supermarket from the car to the kitchen. Imagine that your task is to move a steel cathedral, filled to the brim, along a snake of asphalt that winds through the mountains. This is not poetic exaggeration, it is the physical reality that defines the world of heavy transport. Every day, thousands of men and women sit at the controls of one of the most imposing machines humanity has created for the road, and the first thing they must come to terms with is not the engine or the transmission, but an abstract and ruthless concept: inertia. This is not about a truck part. It is about the enemy that part must face. It's about the brute force of gravity, about the limits of physics as we know it, and about the moment when an engineer, looking at an engine that only knew how to accelerate, had an idea that would change everything. Because to understand why a truck needs to brake with its own heart, we must first understand why its conventional brakes, no matter how big they are doomed to lose the most important battle. A war tank on the road. To our senses, accustomed to the weight of a family car, the figures from the world of heavy transport are abstract, almost unreal. We think of 1 ton, 2, maybe 3, as a considerable weight. Now multiply that by 20, by 30, by 40. A standard loaded trailer can easily move 40 tons. On many routes and for certain types of cargo, 60 tons is not uncommon. And at the limits of what is permitted, there are configurations that approach 80 tons. What does that mean? Let's give that number some substance. 80 tons is the approximate weight of an adult blue whale, the largest animal that has ever existed on Earth. It is the equivalent of stacking more than 50 compact cars on top of each other. It is, to put it in terms that resonate with an image of absolute power, the weight of an Abrams M1 battle tank, with its armor, its cannon, and its crew. Now imagine that Colossus not on caterpillar tracks on a battlefield, but on 18 rubber wheels, gliding at 80 kilometers per hour down a highway. Or worse, imagine it at the top of a mountain pass, with an 8% slope unfolding before it like a launch ramp into the valley. The physics here are relentless and can be summed up in one word: inertia. Inertia is the stubbornness of matter, its resistance to changing its state of motion. An object at rest wants to remain at rest, and an object in motion wants to keep moving in the same direction and at the same speed, unless a force intervenes. The beauty and terror of the truck lies in its titanic inertia. Setting that mass of steel and cargo in motion requires enormous force, generated by an engine with more than 500 horsepower. But stopping it, taming that momentum, requires an equally brutal force. Kinetic energy, which is simply the energy of motion, increases with the square of the speed. Doubling the speed of your car quadruples the energy your brakes must dissipate to stop it. Now apply that to a mass 80 times greater. The energy accumulated in a loaded trailer traveling at highway speed is of monstrous magnitude. It's not just braking, it's trying to contain the fall of a miniature skyscraper. Every time a truck driver presses the brake pedal, he's not just asking for a simple stop. He's waging a microscopic war against one of the fundamental forces of the universe. And in that war, the frontline soldiers, the friction brakes, have a deadly weak point. The lost battle of conventional brakes. Truck brakes, whether the giant drums that spin with the wheels or the massive discs found on more modern models, are masters of transformation. Their job is to take one form of energy, the kinetic energy of the moving truck, and convert it into something else. They can't destroy it. Until energy is destroyed, only transformed. What they do is transform that unstoppable movement into heat. Friction. It's the same principle you use when you rub your palms together to warm them up. The resistance you feel, the heat that is generated, is energy from your movement being dissipated. In a brake, a pad or shoe is pressed with hydraulic or pneumatic force against a disc or drum that rotates with the wheel. The friction is violent, intense. The metals and composites grip, resist, and in that microscopic struggle, the speed of rotation decreases. The energy of the movement leaves the truck and is transferred to the brake material in the form of heat. Herein lies the paradox, the deadly trap of this seemingly perfect system. Heat is both the product of its work and its executioner. Friction materials are designed to operate within an optimal temperature range. But on a long descent, braking is not a one-off event, it is a constant demand. The driver must maintain almost continuous pressure on the pedal to prevent gravity from accelerating the vehicle. It's like trying to drive down a steep hill in your car while keeping your foot on the brake. The brakes don't have time to dissipate the heat they generate into the air because they are generating new heat faster than they can release it. The temperature builds up, and when it exceeds a critical threshold, the phenomenon known as brake fade occurs. It's a deceptively calm name for a situation of pure terror. What happens is that the materials, subjected to extreme heat, begin to degrade. The pads can start to release gases that create an insulating layer between them and the disc, dramatically reducing friction. The discs or drums, red hot, can become deformed. The result is that the driver, pressing the pedal with the same force, feels the resistance disappear. The pedal becomes soft, spongy, as if he were stepping on cotton. The braking force evaporates. Instead of slowing down, the truck begins to accelerate. And at that moment, the driver is faced with a terrifying reality. His main control tools, on which he has relied throughout his career, have betrayed him. Friction, that everyday force that allows us to walk and grasp objects, has reached its absolute limit. A long descent down a mountain for a heavy truck is not a journey, it is a mobile oven that tests the brakes to the point of destruction. And it is at this technical precipice that intuition plays a trick on us because it makes us believe that there is a hidden ally that, in the case of the truck, was never there. The deception of intuition, why your car brakes with the engine and a truck doesn't. If you've driven a manual transmission car on a mountain road, you know the trick. Instead of punishing the brakes on a long descent, you shift into a lower gear. You release the accelerator and immediately feel the vehicle slow down on its own, as if an invisible hand were pulling it back. The engine seems to growl, the revs rise, and the speed is magically restrained. Our intuition tells us the engine is braking, and we're right. But what our intuition doesn't tell us is why our gasoline engine can do that, and why the heart of a truck, a diesel engine, is fundamentally incapable of doing so naturally. Understanding this difference is the key that unlocks the door to all the technology we're about to explore. In a gasoline engine, the air entering the cylinders is controlled by a valve called a throttle. It is literally a gate that the accelerator opens or closes. When you press the accelerator, the throttle opens and allows more air to enter, and the computer injects the corresponding fuel. When you release the accelerator in gear, the throttle closes almost completely. The piston, however, continues to move up and down, driven by the wheels through the transmission. In its intake stroke, it tries to draw in air, but encounters the closed throttle valve. This creates a partial vacuum inside the cylinder. In the following strokes, that vacuum, that lack of air, becomes a formidable resistance. The piston has to fight against the suction it has generated itself. It's like trying to move the plunger of a syringe with your finger covering the tip. It takes a lot of effort. That struggle is energy stolen from the vehicle's movement. The engine stalls, ceases to be a generator, and becomes a vacuum pump that slows the wheels. It's a smooth, progressive, and free braking action. Now, step into the cab of a diesel-powered truck. Its philosophy is different. A traditional diesel engine, especially the naturally aspirated ones that dominated the roads for decades, does not have a throttle valve in the intake. Its design is brutally voracious. It wants all the air it can swallow, all the time. Air enters freely, without restrictions. Power is controlled solely by varying the amount of fuel injected. When a truck driver releases the accelerator on a downhill slope, all they do is cut off the diesel injection. But the pistons continue to move up and down, driven by the wheels. and with each intake stroke, they fill with air at atmospheric pressure without any effort. There is no vacuum, there is no resistance, there is no struggle. The result is as simple as it is terrifying. The diesel engine, disconnected from the fuel, becomes a set of almost free parts. It offers minimal resistance, comparable to that of a highly efficient air compressor. It does not brake. It allows the truck to roll downhill with almost total freedom, like a train car without a locomotive on a slope. Herein lies the fundamental dichotomy. The diesel engine is a fantastic, unparalleled generator of traction force. It is a titan that moves mountains. But as a braking system, in its natural state, it is useless. This inherent contradiction turns every big descent into an act of faith in friction brakes which, as we have already seen, have limited capacity. It is the void that must be filled. It is the problem that cries out for an ingenious solution. And it is in this scenario that the driver's experience turns into a nightmare. The mountain driver's nightmare. Let's put ourselves in their shoes for a moment. This isn't an exercise in imagination, it's reconstructing the collective memory of thousands of professionals before technology came to the rescue. You've made it over the pass. The engine has been roaring for miles, cylinder by cylinder, injecting its brute force to overcome gravity. You reach the top, shift into low gear, and the valley opens up before you, with the road winding down like a scar on the mountain. The first few meters are a relief, the engine rests. But after a few seconds, the speedometer, which had dropped, starts climbing again. Gravity, silent and unstoppable, is winning. You apply the brakes for the first time. The needle drops. You release them. Minutes later, the pace quickens. The taps become more frequent, the pressure on the pedal longer. You begin to notice a sweet, pungent smell seeping through the vents. It is the smell of the brake pad coating burning. It is a warning smell. Your right foot no longer leaves the pedal. You keep it at a constant pressure, looking for the right point where the speed remains stable. But the speedometer needle is treacherous. It rises slightly. You press the pedal harder. The speed is contained, but now you feel something different. Where before there was firm resistance, now there is vagueness. The pedal has gone down a little further than normal. Its response is less immediate. It's fading. Your brain, trained for this, begins to calculate in real time. You have 10 kilometers of descent left. The smell is now that of burnt metal. In the left rearview mirror, you can see thin columns of blue smoke coming out of the rear wheel drums. The heat is so intense that it is burning the dust and oil residue. Your hands are sweaty on the steering wheel. Each curve approaches like a test. Will the brakes hold for this one? And for the next one? You know that if you press too long, the brakes may fail completely. If you don't press hard enough, the speed will get out of hand. It's like walking a tightrope, where the abyss is painted in the colors of the guardrail. This is not a scene from a disaster movie. It was, and in some cases still is, the reality of a poorly planned descent or equipment pushed to its limits. The tension in the cabin is palpable, a silence broken only by the rumble of the road and the beating of your own heart. You need something more. You need an anchor. You need a force to help you hold that colossus, one that doesn't depend on wear and tear and heat. Essentially, you need the giant in front of you, the engine, to stop being a passive spectator and start working in your favor. Or rather, against gravity. That desperate cry from engineering was heard, and the answer did not come from adding something external, but from an idea as brilliant as it was counterintuitive. If the engine does not brake on its own, it will have to be forced to do so. A revolutionary idea is born. If it doesn't brake, make it brake. The solution could not simply be to make the brakes bigger. There was a physical and space limitation. Nor could it be an independent electrical or hydraulic system that consumed energy from the engine, because that would be counterproductive. The answer had to be elegant, efficient, and arise from the very essence of the machine. Thus, the concept of the engine brake or retarder was born. The generic idea is one of overwhelming logical beauty. Instead of fighting the nature of the engine, use it against itself. Take advantage of its own architecture, its work cycle, its mass, and its movement to create resistance. It's not about adding a new brake to the truck. It's about temporarily reconfiguring the engine so that it ceases to be a propulsion system and becomes an obstacle. Imagine a child pushing a swing. You give it momentum to move. That's the engine in traction mode. Now the child slows the swing by stretching out his feet and dragging them along the ground. He is using his own body and his connection to the swing to stop the movement. That is, in essence, what an engine brake does. It turns the engine into the feet that scrape the ground to slow down the swing that is the truck. And in the history of this revolution, one name is written in capital letters: Jacobs Vehicle Systems. In the mid-20th century, its engineers did not look at a diesel engine and see only a power generator. They looked inside that working block of iron, observed the controlled violence of its pistons, the extreme pressure in its cylinders, and saw something else. They saw the potential for restraint. They saw that at the moment of maximum compression, when the air is squeezed to brutal limits, there was stored energy that, if released differently, would not push the truck forward, but would hold it back. They did not invent a new brake. They discovered that the brake had always been there, latent, within the four-stroke cycle, waiting to be activated. This specific system, the most famous and widespread, is known by many names: compression brake, Jake brake, after Jacobs, or Jake brake. Their proposal was so radical that it sounded like science fiction. Without touching the traditional brakes, without pads or discs, the driver could, with a simple switch, command the engine to become a giant air compressor that stole energy from the truck's movement. But transforming an internal combustion engine into a giant air compressor would not be a matter of pressing a button. It would require altering one of the most critical and violent moments inside the cylinder, interfering with the perfect choreography of intake, compression, combustion, and exhaust. In other words, it would require teaching the engine to sabotage itself. And to understand how this engineering feat is achieved, we must leave the mountain and its dangers behind and enter the sanctuary where magic, or rather pure physics, takes place. We must descend into the heart of iron, into the cylinder, and witness the roar of the brake that comes from within. The anatomy of a living brake. The diesel engine is a masterpiece of controlled violence. Inside its cast iron block, in sealed chambers bathed in oil, a primordial conflict between pressure, heat, and movement rages thousands of times per minute. It is a conflict that, when directed in one direction, produces the unstoppable forward motion of a truck. But there is a switch, an idea, that can twist that violence toward an opposite purpose. Let's now take a journey inside that miracle. We leave behind the epic scale of mountains and titanic weights to focus on the microcosm where everything happens. Here, in the space of a few cubic centimeters, in the journey of a few centimeters of a piston, is where an engine ceases to be a servant of acceleration and becomes a master of braking. We are going to witness, step by step, how the most brilliant mechanical coup in automotive engineering is executed. How the roar of power becomes the roar of control. The 4 beats of a diesel engine. Purposeful review. Before altering the rhythm, we must know the original song. The 4-stroke cycle of a diesel engine is not an arbitrary sequence. It is a perfect dance, a ritual of converting chemical energy into mechanical motion. Let's imagine a single cylinder. The piston is its athlete, a runner that only moves in a straight line, up and down, inside its cylinder. The first movement is intake. The piston begins its downward stroke. It is a suction movement, an opening. A valve in the cylinder head opens and pure, dense air is sucked in from outside. The cylinder fills. There are no restrictions, no throttles. It is a deep, voracious gulp of the atmosphere. Then comes the second stroke, compression. The piston, having reached the bottom, reverses direction and begins to rise. Both valves, intake and exhaust, are tightly closed. The trapped air has nowhere to escape. As the piston rises, the space shrinks. The air is squeezed, compressed, packed into a fraction of its original volume. The pressure skyrockets. The temperature, as an inevitable consequence of compression, rises dramatically. This is a critical moment. The piston is doing a monumental job. It is investing mechanical energy from the inertia of the crankshaft or other cylinders to store potential energy in the form of high-pressure, high-temperature air. It's like compressing a giant spring to its limit. All the force of the piston's ascent is being converted into a pressure pump ready to explode. The third act is combustion, or explosion. Just before the piston reaches the highest point of its stroke, top dead center, a fine spray of diesel fuel is injected directly into this ultra-hot, ultra-compressed air chamber. No spark is needed. The environment is so hostile that the fuel ignites spontaneously, in a controlled but violent manner. The resulting explosion is not a sharp bang, but an expansion of burning gases that push the piston head down with titanic force. It is the release of the spring. All the potential energy stored in the compression, plus the chemical energy of the fuel, is now converted into the powerful thrust that turns the crankshaft and, ultimately, the wheels. This is the heartbeat that brings the truck to life. Finally, the fourth stroke, exhaust. The piston, driven by the inertia of the crankshaft and the thrust of other cylinders, rises again. This time, the exhaust valve opens. The piston acts as an ejector, sweeping the burned, useless gases out of the cylinder and sending them to the exhaust manifold. The cylinder is purged, prepared. And when the piston reaches the top again, the exhaust valve closes, the intake valve opens, and the cycle begins again. Intake, compression, combustion, exhaust. It is the mechanical mantra, the vital rhythm that moves the world. This is normality. But what if, at the most tense moment at the climax of compression, we changed the rules? The mechanical coup, disrupting the vital rhythm. Imagine the scene inside the cylinder during the compression stroke. The piston is on its final ascent. The air is being squeezed against the cylinder head. The pressure is hundreds of pounds per square inch. The temperature exceeds 500 degrees Celsius. The piston is a millisecond away from reaching top dead center, the moment when, in the normal cycle, the injector would fire its fuel charge to initiate combustion. The stored potential energy is at its maximum. It is the moment of maximum tension, just before release. Now, activate the Jake brake. At that precise moment, an electrical signal travels to a solenoid. This, in turn, activates a hydraulic or pneumatic mechanism that does something extraordinary. It opens the exhaust valve. Not the intake valve, but the exhaust valve, the exit door. And it opens it not at the end of the cycle, but at the very peak of compression. The analogy is perfect. It's like blowing up a balloon with all the strength in your lungs. You've blown and blown, the balloon is tense, full of compressed air about to burst. Just as you are about to tie it so that all that compressed energy is stored, you let go of the nozzle. What happens? A violent burst of air escapes, the balloon shoots erratically across the room, and all the energy you put into inflating it dissipates in an instant of noisy chaos. There is no useful thrust, only wasted force. That's exactly what happens inside the cylinder. When you open the exhaust valve at top dead center of compression, the brutally pressurized air doesn't have to wait for the piston to be pushed down by an explosion. It escapes immediately, violently, into the exhaust manifold. The piston, which had risen with great effort to create that pressure, reaches its highest point and, instead of receiving the powerful thrust of combustion, finds that the pressure beneath it has disappeared. It has been released. There is no force to push it down. Worse still, in its next movement, the piston must begin its downward stroke, but now it does so in a cylinder where the pressure is much lower than normal, almost atmospheric. There is no cushion of expanding gases, there is almost a vacuum. The result is that the descent of the piston, far from providing energy, becomes a movement that extracts energy. From generator to consumer, the engine that swallows its own power. Now multiply that effect by 6, 8, 10, 12 cylinders, working in a sequence perfectly coordinated by the crankshaft. In the normal cycle, each cylinder, at its combustion time, gives a powerful push to the crankshaft, helping to accelerate it, and therefore the truck. With the Jake brake activated, each cylinder, in its modified compression time, gives a tug. The sequence changes. Instead of push, 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 push from the combustion cylinders, we have tug, 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 tug from the cylinders that steal energy. Where does the energy come from to perform this compression work that ends in a useless explosion? It comes from the movement of the truck itself. The wheels, rolling downhill by the force of gravity, turn. That rotation is transmitted through the differential and gearbox to the engine crankshaft. The crankshaft, in turn, forces the pistons to rise to perform the compression. It is a perfect circle of energy consumption. The inertia of the truck going downhill provides the force for the engine's seetor to perform a task, compressing air, which, being sabotaged at the last moment, does not return energy, but dissipates it in the form of heat and sound in the exhaust. The engine ceases to be the boss, the provider. It becomes the greatest internal enemy of movement. It is an active ballast, an internal anchor whose pistons are no longer propellers but brake pumps. It stops converting fuel into motion and starts converting motion into noise and heat. This is why the technical name, compression brake, is so accurate. Braking does not occur in the explosion, but in the very act of compressing the air and then wasting that compression. It is braking by sabotaging the production cycle. The tamer's controls how the driver invokes the brake. In the cab, invoking this force is not a magical act, but a precise dance with the machine. It is not enough to want to brake. You have to create the conditions for the engine to accept its new role. First, there is the dedicated switch, often marked with a stylized tree leaf symbol by Jacobs or with the words engine brake or Jake. This switch is not a pedal, it is a toggle switch that prepares the system, telling the computer and hydraulic actuators to be ready. But activating the switch does nothing on its own. The driver must fulfill two crucial physical conditions, a two-step ritual that is the key to everything. First, the foot must be completely off the accelerator. This makes sense. If fuel is injected, the engine returns to its normal combustion cycle and the brake is deactivated. Second, and this is the most critical, the clutch pedal must be released and the transmission must be engaged in a gear. This is the point that baffles the uninitiated. The reason is fundamental. The Jake brake only works if the engine is mechanically connected to the wheels. If you press the clutch, you disengage the transmission. The engine continues to spin freely, without load, and the wheels roll freely. There is no connection. The engine may try to compress and release, but since it is not forced to raise the pistons by the inertia of the truck, but only by its own kinetic energy, the effect is minimal and would be quickly lost. It's like trying to brake a truck by pushing the air in front of you. The Jake brake needs the truck to push the engine so that it can resist. That's why the driver chooses a low gear, releases the accelerator, releases the clutch, and then the system kicks in. It's a dance. Switch on, foot off the accelerator, clutch released, gear engaged. The levels, low, medium, high, in modern systems are no longer usually the number of cylinders, but the intensity of the valve opening or the moment it opens. But the idea is the same, to control the aggressiveness of the internal brake. Low is a whisper of restraint. High is a fierce growl of braking. The driver modulates this according to the slope and weight, looking for the right point where the speed remains constant without touching the brake pedal. The orchestra of noise, why it sounds like an angry god. And so we come to the sound. That metallic, hammering roar that defines the descent of a heavy truck. It's not the sound of combustion. We've already cut off the fuel injection. It's the sound of air exploding. Think again of the balloon. The pop it makes when released is the sudden release of compressed air causing a sonic shockwave inside a truck's exhaust manifold. That pop occurs, but in a controlled and sequential manner, cylinder after cylinder, dozens of times per second. The air, compressed to extreme pressures, is released suddenly through the open exhaust valve. It hits the walls of the manifold, expands violently, and creates a low-frequency but brutally intense sound wave. It is a dull, dry bang. At the high level, where all cylinders are engaged, the sequence of these bangs is so rapid and powerful that they merge into a continuous tat-tat-tat-tat, a mechanical hammering that reverberates across the landscape. It is the sound of the truck's kinetic energy being crushed, cylinder by cylinder, into pure acoustics. It is not the sound of effort, it is the sound of effort being nullified. It is the soundtrack of physics being forced to work in reverse. And it is because of this sound power, this acoustic declaration of contained force, that the Jake brake is banned in so many urban and residential areas. It is not a whim. The noise can easily exceed 100 decibels, comparable to a chainsaw or a rock concert. In the quiet of the night, in a residential neighborhood near a highway, that roar is not the sound of safety, it is intolerable noise pollution. The no engine brake or compression brake prohibited signs are not there out of hatred for technology, but as a pact of coexistence. They are a reminder that this formidable power, born in the cylinder, has an echo that extends far beyond the road. Mastering this roar, however, is only half the art. Because in inexperienced hands, or under the wrong conditions, this life-saving force can, in an instant, unleash chaos on the road. The line between control and disaster is as thin as a layer of ice on the asphalt. Because the Jake brake, brilliant as it is not an omnipotent power. It has strict rules, dangerous limits, and a HY context in which its use becomes a high-precision act, where a mistake in timing or judgment can twist the truck around or send it into an uncontrollable skid. The third act of this story is not about power, but about the responsibility that comes with wielding it. The perfect descent strategy, it's not just a button. For the novice driver, the Jake brake is a button that brakes. For the professional, it is an energy management tool. The difference between these two concepts is what separates a controlled descent from an emergency. The strategy begins long before the first slope. An expert driver, when approaching a long descent, evaluates. They weigh their load, calculate the slope from signs or their knowledge of the terrain, and select the gear before beginning the descent. The golden rule is enter slow, exit slow. A gear low enough is chosen so that the engine, with the Jake activated, can maintain a safe speed without using the service brakes. The common mistake is to activate the Jake when speed control has already been lost, when the truck accelerates and the engine brake is used as a desperate solution. That is a recipe for wear and tear and loss of control. The correct procedure is to enter the descent at a moderate speed, activate the Jake at the appropriate level, usually high, and let its restraining force balance the force of gravity from the outset. The goal is not to drastically reduce speed, but to prevent it from increasing. Here, the service brakes, friction brakes, take on a new role. They are no longer the primary system, but become a fine-tuning system. The driver uses them in short, firm pulses to cut a few kilometers per hour if necessary, or to prepare for a sharp curve. The perfect analogy is a water tank with a hole in it. The Jake brake is the tap that is open to equalize the inflow, keeping the level constant. The friction brakes are the finger that momentarily covers the hole to reduce the level a little if it rises too high. One is for continuous containment, the other is for timely correction. This strategy preserves brake temperature, maintains control, and transforms a stressful descent into a methodical and safe procedure. It is the choreography of the professional. The 3 deadly sins of the Jake brake, where salvation becomes a threat. However, even the best choreography can fail if the scenario is ignored. The Jake brake has 3 fundamental limitations that, if overlooked, turn the savior into the executioner. The treacherous axle. The Jake brake acts only on the drive axle, that is, on the wheels that are driven by the engine, usually the rear wheels of the tractor. The trailer, with its multiple axles, is not affected. On a dry, straight road, this is not a problem. But on a curve, or on a slippery surface, rain, ice, gravel, it creates a situation of critical instability. By braking only the rear wheels of the tractor tends to slow down slightly before the trailer. The trailer, with its immense inertia, pushes the tractor from behind. If the tractor is not perfectly aligned, this thrust can cause the rear of the tractor to slide or the whole combination to bend into a V shape. This is the dreaded jackknife, where the trailer swings around the tractor, blocking the road and often overturning. That's why, on sharp curves or in low traction conditions, experienced drivers disable the Jake and rely on smooth, straight pulses of the service brakes, which act on all axles of the train. Dead silence, low RPM. The Jake brake needs the engine to be running hard, typically above 1,200 or 1,500 revolutions per minute, for the compression to be powerful enough and the engine to have the inertia to keep going. Activating the Jake at too low an RPM, for example, in a very high gear at low speed, can have a catastrophic effect. It stalls the engine. The resistance it generates is so great that the engine simply stops. And when a diesel engine shuts down, everything shuts down. The power steering becomes heavy as a rock, and more seriously, the air pump that keeps the air brakes pressurized stops working. In a matter of seconds, the driver can be left without power steering and, worse still, without air brakes in the middle of a descent. It is one of the most dangerous situations imaginable when driving a truck. The invisible enemy, cold engine and low oil. The Jake brake subjects the engine to extreme stresses, similar to those of combustion but without the lubricating and cooling effect of burned fuel. Oil is the lifeblood that lubricates and extracts heat from the components. Using the Jake brake with a cold engine, when the oil is thick and not circulating optimally or with low oil levels, is a death sentence for bearings, pistons and cylinders. Metal rubs against metal without adequate protection, generating scorching heat that does not dissipate. The damage can be severe and extremely costly, prematurely wearing out the very heart of the machine it is intended to protect. Beyond Jake, the universe of retarders. The Jake brake, though iconic, is not alone in its mission. It is the patriarch of a family of technologies known generically as retarders or holding brakes, each with its own philosophy. Hydrodynamic retarders, sometimes called water brakes, although they use oil, are a completely independent system, coupled to the transmission. Their principle is elegant. A rotor spins inside a chamber filled with oil. When activated, the oil is projected against the rotor blades, and the resistance of moving this dense fluid generates a massive and progressive braking force. It is exceptionally smooth and powerful, ideal for very long descents, but adds weight, complexity, and cost. Electromagnetic retarders, or electric brakes, use magnetism. An electromagnet slows down a metal disc that rotates with the drive shaft without physical contact, generating clean, electronically adjustable resistance with millimeter precision. They are common in buses and delivery trucks. There are even exhaust braking systems, which place a damper in the exhaust to create back pressure, choking the engine and stealing energy from the exhaust gases. The cutting edge, in high-end trucks such as European long-haul trucks, is the smart combination. An engine can be equipped with a Jake brake for primary braking and a hydrodynamic or electromagnetic retarder integrated into the rear axle or transmission for additional power and extreme smoothness. The driver has a control that orchestrates all these systems at once, creating engine braking power that can exceed, in terms of holding force, the traction power of the engine itself. The electronic evolution, when the chip takes control. The future is already here in the most modern cabs, and it's called integration. The engine control unit, ECU, no longer just manages injection. Now, connected to slope sensors, GPS, radar and stability controls, it becomes the autopilot for engine braking. Systems such as automatic hill descent allow the driver to set a target speed. The ECU, detecting the slope via GPS or an inclinometer sensor, automatically activates the Jake brake and modulates its intensity, and in the case of the E, even changes gears if necessary, to maintain exactly that speed without the driver touching any pedals. Even smarter, the system can automatically deactivate the Jake brake when it detects a sharp curve via GPS or a steering angle sensor to prevent instability and reactivate it when exiting the curve. It can modulate the intensity based on the gross weight of the vehicle, calculated by the suspension sensors. The driver is no longer an operator but a supervisor, a strategist who delegates technical execution to an infallible electronic system that never tires. The roar of the Jake is no longer just a manual command. It is the response of a digital nervous system that perceives the world and reacts to maintain balance.